Hello. Hi. It's lovely to see everyone looking so enthusiastic. You've obviously been enjoying your lunch, your food this evening, and all of the great conversations. But yes, I think we're going to try and make a start. So a warm welcome to all of you, and we're so happy that you could be here at the Wen Forum event for International Women's Day. So I'm Monique Johnson. I'm the chair of Wen. And I'm delighted that you could all join us this evening. As you know, throughout the course of the evening, we'll be exploring the question of why gender, racial and social equity are key to addressing the climate crisis. This evening, we are joined by a fantastic panel of speakers, and they'll help us to answer this question. And we'll also be sharing information about the Feminist Green New Deal and the Climate Sisters Project. So a bit of housekeeping before we start. We're not expecting any fire alarms, so if you do hear any bells, please do use the fire exits, which are located to your right. What else do we need to know? So we'll be recording the event, and that's purely for the purposes of sharing on social media afterwards. If you are using social media, if you could please use the hashtags hashtag Wen Forum, hashtag Feminist Green New Deal, hashtag Feminist Climate Justice. And if you're wanting to find out a bit more about this evening's programme and about the bios of the speakers that we'll be hearing from today, there is a postcard on your seat, so please use the QR code on there to find out some more information. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to welcome onto the stage our first speaker, who's Dr. Mary Ann Stevenson, the Director of the Women's Budget Group, who will tell you a little bit more about the Feminist Green New Deal.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm so happy to be here today. It's such a relief after spending about a day and a half responding to yesterday's budget, which I work for the Women's Budget Group. The clue is in the name. That's kind of what we do. It felt really strange actually watching the budget. You know, we've had the hottest February on record in the world, but there was no sense in the Chancellor's speech about the scale of the emergency that we're facing. There was no sense of the seriousness of the action that government needs to take. There were a few relatively minor announcements about low carbon initiatives. There was an extension of the windfall tax, although there's all sorts of problems with that. But there was no feeling from the Chancellor that this was something that required major action. Indeed, he chose to continue with the freeze on fuel duty, which we know largely benefits richer men who drive bigger cars for longer distances. But this was, in keeping with the budget that failed to address the problems that the country's facing across the board. So, we have families in this country struggling with rising living costs. 3.8 million people are living in destitution. Half of lone parent families are in poverty. And the main headline from the budget was a cut to national insurance contributions that will leave single men £670 a year better off on average, and lone mothers £161 better off on average, while the public services they rely on face cuts from next year. And there's a pattern here, and it's a pattern of a combined crisis of climate and inequality, and it's a pattern of policymakers failing to realise that women are often hit harder, whether it's by the impacts of climate change or the spiralling cost of living, but still failing to do anything about it. Because we know, and we'll hear more about this over the course of this evening, that climate change does not affect everyone equally, and that throughout the world, women and girls are more vulnerable to its impacts. This is especially true in poorer countries where we're already seeing extreme climate change related weather events, including droughts, floods and hurricanes, all of which create problems, massive relocation of people. Because women and girls generally shoulder more of the burden of care than men, they're under more pressure when disaster strikes. They're the ones who are responsible for finding food and shelter for children and other relatives. And as those events exacerbate and cause conflicts around the world, women and girls are increasingly at risk of male violence and face higher barriers to accessing healthcare, including reproductive healthcare that they may need. In the UK, women do 60% more unpaid work than men. Most of that's care work, which means that they earn less, own less, and are more likely to be poor. And they're much more likely to be heads of single parent households than men. Nearly 90% of single parent households are headed by women, which makes them disproportionately vulnerable to the costs of climate change. So that could be something like inflated gas prices, which could have been prevented if the government had properly invested in renewable energy. Or it could be because women tend to be the people who've got the main responsibility for feeding their families and for managing household budgets. So dealing with rising food prices because of floods or droughts, paying for household repairs after a flood, being unable to work because their child's school is closed because of a flood or because of a heat wave. But the same government that can talk about dealing with the rising cost of living by cutting taxes in a way that benefits better off men rather than the poorest women who are hit by the rising cost of living, it is a similar response in terms of the climate emergency. Policies to prevent and cope with the impacts of climate change rarely consider the gendered nature of those impacts. But it doesn't have to be like this. And that's why at the Women's Budget Group, we were really delighted to be able to work with the Women's Environmental Network on our joint feminist Green New Deal project. There was a stall downstairs. You can see lovely copies of all the reports. And that was really to come up with an alternative vision, but also to bring people together, to bring women together in the workshops that Wen organised around the country to talk about climate change, for women to talk about the policies they wanted to see, but also policy workshops to bring together women's organisations, environmental organisations, organisations working on economic justice, to discuss a gendered approach to the climate emergency and to have dialogue between those different groups. So we were able to feed into the policymakers the ideas that were coming from grassroots groups and feed back to those groups some of the policies that were coming up to see whether or not those worked. And we came up with a vision for doing things differently, how we can build a society and an economy based on the values of care and sustainability. We talked about a huge range of issues. I just want to touch on a few of them. So we talked about where and how we live, you know, how we can have safe, decent and affordable housing, how we can retrofit to reduce emissions and reduce bills. We talked about where and how we travel and women and men's different travel patterns. So women are less likely to do a sort of standard commute from home into work in the morning and back again in the evening. There's much more trip chaining. So dropping the kids at school, going to work, coming back via the shop, then going to see your mum, making sure she's all right, then going home. That requires different sorts of public transport and a focus particularly on buses and also walking and cycling routes. We talked about how we work, so how we can redistribute paid and unpaid work more fairly. So ensure that everyone has access to decent, well-paid and secure jobs, but also so that we can reduce the working week so we have more time for other activities. We talked about how we shop and consume, how we can ensure that the goods that we buy are built to last and that they can be repaired or recycled and that we can think about the working conditions of production. We talked about what and how we eat, how we can build a sustainable food system, how we can move towards a more plant-based diet, how we can make locally produced and nutritious food available and accessible and affordable for everyone. And we talked about how we care. We talked about the importance of investing in high quality social care and early education and childcare, which would create millions of good green jobs. And we talked about the importance of care in a just transition. So it's a vision of transformation, but it's also one that's possible, and it's one that addresses the twin crises of climate and inequality together. And that's not just because they're both important, but because they both have the same roots. Both are caused and reinforced by an economic system that carelessly exploits both the Earth's resources and its people, particularly women and marginalised groups, for profit. And we can rewire our system to care for both people and planet. And that starts with the sort of conversations like the ones we're going to have this evening. So thank you very much. That's it from me. I now would like to welcome onto the stage the Wen Climate Sisters programme. So we have Roshini, Rebecca and Elea. Would you like to come up to the stage? Thank you.
Hi everybody, thanks for coming. So a quick intro to Climate Sisters. It's a programme at Wen where we meet with groups of women in community and have chats, have discussions, talk about all things climate, talk about how that's affecting us in our daily life. And it's kind of not rocket science. Like we meet, we talk, we discuss, we organise. But in a system of where we just heard from Mary Ann how, you know, those stats of like this pervasive patriarchy that we still live in, those spaces become really quite necessary just to be able to resource ourselves, to talk and have some time in this kind of neoliberal, capitalist, rushy dynamic that we're in. So yeah, that's a bit about Climate Sisters intro.
Part of Climate Sisters is kind of listening to new voices, because if we think of where kind of the world's at the moment, you know, the systems that we all live under are not working. They're not working for us, they're not working for the planet. They've been rooted in things that are exploitative of people and the planet, and just perpetuating these and like listening to the same people over and over again, we're just going to stay in the same situation. So it's really important that we start to listen to new voices and like, you know, look at whose voices aren't being heard. So part of Climate Sisters is looking at women's voices and people who have not been traditionally represented within climate spaces, and making sure that everyone's voices are heard, because, you know, we're all affected by climate change, and there's no point in having like things in climate policy that only help you if you're rich and white. Like, you know, we have to listen to like what affects all of us, and part of Climate Sisters is kind of going, okay, so what affects like everyday people, what affects people from like global majority, what is affecting people who have family like that don't live in the UK, and just really like trying to connect those dots and yeah, get a variety of perspectives into the climate arena.
Hi everyone, my name is Alea Tahir. I'm part of the Climate Sister project. I've been enjoying sharing knowledge and the learning from each other. I'm helping my community. I've been helping for many years. And I'm born and brought up in Bangladesh, and also I'm living in Tower Hamlet. And you can see that our hamlet and Bangladesh to compare, because of I'm born and brought up in Bangladesh, my whole family my generation is back home. So I can see, like in my community, suffer so much in Tower Hamlet as well, like, you know, the food shortage, and then also the Bengali women, Bangladeshi women like our age who's not working. So we need help and support actually because of the lockdown and everything. That people suffer so much actually, like all the women that go problem and issue, like mental health issue, the problem that even the home, they stay such a 2 years inside. And now they don't want to come out because of the problem issues, all this. I can't nag of them, the sisters, you need to come out and we need to help each other for the community. And also like back home, the climate change back home is so much problem actually because of the drought, because of the climate change, because of this weather, people can't grow anymore. Because, you know, before was my parents, when we in Bangladesh, we go, so much thing we used to grow, but now it's nothing growing because of the climate change. It's flooding and the drought is not working anymore. And so many diseases after the flood, that the children and mothers, they're suffering so much. They're vulnerable to kids actually, because now, and all the soil is gone so bad actually, like people using chemical. So out of chemical, you grow your food. Now people go, all the illness came out now because of the, you name it. People go die, people go disease. They have to end up, because of the food, they end up in a hospital and doctors, cancer, ulcer, you name it, all the illness they go. So even in Tower Hamlet, like in the food shortage and all this, I'm working with the community. We've got the garden, actually, we are so lucky we've got the growing space. So from the council, we've got a growing space, so I'm just calling to the ladies to come and grow more food, fresh vegetable, fresh fruit. So also we do workshop actually how to grow the food and how to cook them. So we do like cooking workshop and teaching mothers how to get the fresh fruit to cook. Actually, if you buy all the chemicals from, or if you buy the food and it's all the chemical stuff, you're feeding your family is chemical and you're giving all the disease and everything. And if you teach the mothers like how to grow your fresh fruit and then you cook and feed your kids, then it's good for our health and environment and everything. So that's why I'm helping the community to get together and do the workshop, and also the climate sisters. We're just sharing all the time actually how we're going to help our community and our sisters to go with each other, and we're sharing knowledge and everything. So thank you so much.
We're not finished. No, we're really not finished. One last thing was about just to touch on, just to really hone in on the fact that within the Climate Sisters, to really redress this balance of women, racialized people, trans people, non-binary people, queer people, minoritized people, marginalized people need teaching something, when actually we need to just flip that script, because we're not a deficit, we're an asset, and we need to be readdressing things in this light, in this way. So that's quite an important part of our Climate Sisters. And the last thing before the round of applause is the intro to the amazing.
So yeah, we've made a short video with featuring some of our Climate Sisters, and part of Climate Sisters is that we think is very important is that we make it accessible as possible, and part of that is language. So we try to break down like language barriers, so people have been able to speak in their mother tongue, and we've had translators and things, so you will see that in the video.
And I would like to say and I would like to say thank you to Roshani and Rebecca for all the help and hard work. Thank you.
About amplifying our voices, making our voices heard, enough of having people decide for us. There's a lot to say and a lot to listen to, and it's imperative that all voices are represented. The ethos behind Climate Sisters is about facilitating spaces for discussion. Once you get people together, there's common factors everybody faces in their day-to-day, which is the lived experience of climate disaster. Climate Sisters is a way of coming together to honour the knowledge that we all have of how climate change affects us directly. From this co-created space where we've been talking about climate justice and how it affects us, here's some of what we've got to say.
আমি দেশত শান্তি চাই, দেশখান শান্তি হইতো, ওটাও চাইলাম আমার
Thank you so much. That video was perfect and it illustrated exactly why we need programs like Climate Sisters. So yeah, thank you so much, Rashini, Leo, and Rebecca. That was brilliant. So now I'd like to invite our panelists to come to the stage, and we're going to have a short discussion, and then we're going to have a Q&A. So first up, may I introduce Dr. Marianne Stevenson, Director of the Women's Budget Group. So Marianne has been instrumental in this area for over 20 years and was appointed as the first director of the Women's Budget Group in 2017. Next up, may I introduce Nina Jeffs, Academy Associate in the Environment and Society Programme at Chatham House. Closer, like that, okay, yeah. Okay, and then may I introduce Dr. Amira Sawas, Head of Research and Policy at the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. Amira is a feminist researcher and advocate who works at the intersections of climate change, gender justice, public participation, and the social contract. Next, may I invite Devile Mokoena, who is the project coordinator for Gender CC Southern Africa. So Gender CC looks at gender, climate, and social justice. And last but not least, may I invite Lola Fayokan, Youth Climate Justice Campaigner and member of Advisory Board Uplift. Lola is heavily involved with the UK Student Climate Network, the Grassroots Network, hosting youth climate strikes in the UK. And sorry, Rashini, please may I welcome you to the stage as well. Who needs no introduction. Climate Systems Program Manager, Sisters Program Manager at Wen. Okay, so for the next few minutes, I would really like it if I could ask each of you in turn to give your perspective and experience on why is gender, racial and social equity key to addressing the climate crisis. And I've been asked if you could each take the microphone as you give your responses. So Nina, may I ask you to answer that first? I don't know if that will stretch.
I'll take this one.
Okay. Thanks very much for the invitation to speak. It's such an honor to be here and with such amazing panelists as well. I've been asked to speak to the urban angle of this challenge of gender, social and racial justice and addressing the climate crisis. Especially speaking from my experiences managing the Women for Climate program at C40 Cities. So just to start off with, I think Dr. Stevenson made it very clear why the impacts of climate change are unfair, and especially in an intersectional way. So not just looking at gender or race or income or any kind of factor by themselves, but looking at how they compound and how people are exposed to the negative impacts of climate change. And I'd just like to highlight, you know, like Dr. Stevenson said, the impacts of climate change are unequal on a global scale. So women and girls in particular in the global south who've done the least to contribute to the climate crisis are particularly hit by its impacts, but also within the UK, there's a justice issue there too. And it's not just the direct impacts of climate change like extreme weather events like floods and droughts, which are of course very serious, but it's also the wider economic and social impacts of climate change too. So for example, women in developing countries, especially women with disabilities, are more likely to be working in the informal sector, which means they have more limited social protection, like access to insurance or welfare, so that if one of these extreme weather events hits, actually it's harder for them to recover their livelihood afterwards, aside from all of these other challenges that Dr. Stevenson and others have already mentioned. And there's also a lot of gender, social and racial inequalities in terms of access to green jobs in cities. So research by C40 Cities found that without special just transition measures, by the end of the century, women will make up less than 40% of people working in green jobs, so jobs that contribute to tackling the climate crisis, and that people of colour and youth would also be underrepresented. We also see that all of these different groups of marginalised communities are underrepresented in decision making on climate change at a local level, city level, national level, and international level. So of course solutions are less likely to meet their needs, because if you're not in the room, how do you make sure that your experiences are heard, your skills and knowledge are being taken into account, not just your needs, but your own contributions that you can make too, which I think Rashini said really beautifully earlier. We also know that fairer solutions are more likely to be accepted by the public. When cities actually have participation from the public in making policies and programs based on their needs, they're more likely to be accepted afterwards. So just to touch on briefly why think about cities at all, the majority of the world's population lives in cities, and the world is still rapidly urbanizing. So cities are going to play a more and more important role. And cities have a huge economic influence, and they produce a lot of the greenhouse gas emissions in the world, actually. And cities around the world are also playing a really progressive role on climate solutions that promote equality. So there's the coalition of about 100 world-leading cities called C40 Cities in particular that are really leading on this. And I'd just like to quickly highlight 2 examples of initiatives, because talking about the challenges, it's also nice to look at where progress is being made. So just briefly, the city of Bogota, under the leadership of Mayor Claudia Lopez, has been a real leader on feminist solutions to climate change, centering those principles of care and sustainability that you mentioned. So there's an initiative that's worked with thousands of women in the city called Women Who Regreen, which works with women from marginalized communities, particularly who've experienced violence in their life, to help them access work on regreening the city, provide them grants, education and training, and taking quite a holistic approach to helping them into these more sustainable jobs. There's also a system of care blocks throughout the city, which is all about caring for carers. So recognizing that actually the backbone of society and the economy is often women doing unpaid care work, and that's so important for the resilience of communities economically and in response to environmental challenges too. So in these care blocks, they have childcare, education, access to technology for carers and so forth. And also the city's climate policy more broadly last year had a really broad, inclusive and participatory process to actually formalize these things into a climate policy that will last. Just briefly before I wrap up, the Women for Climate initiative has been run by C40 in partnership with the L'Oreal Foundation for 7 years. And it's essentially a mentorship program for women leading inclusive climate change solutions in different cities around the world. It's been run in 22 cities in every continent in the world. And the idea is really connecting women who are leading climate justice initiatives in their communities with decision makers who can see the impact of those initiatives and helping them to scale up, and also helping them to actually influence the way that policymakers and city staff think about designing solutions to economic and social and environmental challenges. So I've been told that if you scan the QR code on the postcard, you can actually read a little bit more about some of the resources we've prepared to capture some of the impacts and lessons learned from that initiative. So overall, just to close, like I've said, it's really a matter of justice, and these challenges are intertwined, and there are also joint solutions that actually a lot of cities are piloting and that we can learn from as well. So thanks very much.
It's lovely. Thank you, Nina. Amira, may I invite you to answer the same question?
So great being on panels with feminists. I feel like I don't have to explain, it's just understanding. But of course, the question is very broad, and I could talk all your ears off for hours on end about this. So I think I'll just start with saying, obviously, equity has to be at every single level. But in the respect of time, I just thought I'd highlight 3 key numbers that I think about a lot, that I think tell a top line story. about gendered, racist injustice, which upholds the climate crisis and which we need to address. So the first number is 152 trillion US dollars. So that's how much northern countries have drained from the global south since 1960. And that's 30 times more in real terms than the development aid that we've given back. So we drain commodities worth 2.2 trillion a year from the south while degrading their resilience to climate change at the same time. We import resources and we export our pollution. So this 2.2 trillion would be enough to end extreme poverty globally 15 times over. And since women and girls and marginalized minorities across the world make up the majority of the world's poor, this is quite significant in terms of gender equality and racial injustice. And then when we actually look at those global supply chains, it's poor women and girls and marginalized minorities who tend to be disproportionately affected by their negative externalities. These compound the many barriers in their own societies that they're already facing around restricted land rights, restricted mobilities, barriers in accessing cash and credit, gender-based violence, and other elements. And the recent UN Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Racism concluded her work recently with a special report which said there can be no meaningful mitigation or resolution of the global ecological crisis without specific action to address systemic racism, in particular the historic and contemporary racial legacies of colonialism and slavery. And the science in the IPCC is clear that the colonial period was a critical period for driving global emissions, where they really catapulted and put global warming where it is today. So the lives that we lead here are based on historical colonial exploitation of the global south, which weakened those countries' resilience. I'm not saying the global south is one blob of countries, but if we're talking in political and economic terms, it has weakened their resilience, and there are very clear legacies today. The same UN Special Rapporteur called these sacrifice zones for environmental degradation driven by our lifestyles here. And of course, when we look at it, the majority of decision makers during that period of colonial expansion were, of course, white men from the elite and middle class. So women didn't have that much say in the decisions at that time, and the women who have say now, well, certainly in some of the corridors of power from more elite backgrounds. The second figure that has really stayed with me ever since I heard it is 93%. So 93% of countries that are vulnerable to climate change are in debt distress. So debt, and this is something I'm learning in the work I'm doing now, that debt and the international financial system are possibly the biggest barriers to tackling climate change at a global scale. From 2011 to 22, the number of developing countries with high debt almost tripled. So debt is rising as well. And the idea, the notion of climate finance, I'm not saying it shouldn't exist, but the way it's being delivered from the north to the south isn't helping. Firstly, the north are not fulfilling their commitments and they're double counting and kind of hiding the money. But secondly, 70% is being provided as loans. So we caused the crisis, and now we're saying we'll support you, but we're going to rack up your debt, high interest rates, and make it more difficult for you to invest in yourselves. So how does this affect women of the global majority? And when I speak about women of the global majority, I mean women across the global south, women of color, women from minorities. Well, in disasters, states have to search for finances to respond. And austerity measures often hit the ministries and budgets that are of most importance for gender equality and other, forms of tackling injustice. So whether that's the health ministry, the education ministry, the transport ministry. And secondly, debt relief attempts often fail to recognize gendered power dynamics. So solutions can often actually worsen women's rights and increase the barriers to resilience. Also, debt is keeping countries across the global south tied to fossil fuel exporting, and fossil fuels are responsible for 86% of the global emissions that have caused climate change, so we really need to deal with them. But they're being stuck there. So in my role now, we're working with 12 governments. One of them, Colombia, has been very clear that they want to move away from fossil fuel extraction, but 60% of their GDP depends on fossil fuel exports, and they don't have any support. And it's very hard for them to access credit because of how unfair the international financial system is. And then the third figure, and the last figure I promise, is 1%. And that's how much climate finance or bilateral aid flows to women-led organisations. Less than 10% to local organisations, and only 3% of all climate-related aid has gender equality as a principal objective. So these decision makers are not getting it. The patriarchal norms are there, the racist norms are there. Where the money is going is not going to the people who are living the crisis and have solutions that are important for it. And you just can't have effective climate action if 51% of the world are not being involved, and certainly not having the finances to lead. And there's a lot of evidence, which I don't have time now to talk about, that when you have gender parity in decision making, and when you have women's leadership, not uncritically, but when you have it, you tend to have better results in terms of efficiency, environmental policies, and inclusion outcomes. But despite this evidence and 15 years of efforts in the UN with dedicated programs and over 80 related mandates on women's leadership and gender equality in a gender action plan, in 15 years, women's leadership has only increased by 3% in the formal markers that they look at in terms of negotiators and so on. So it's not changing. So women and girls are disproportionately affected by the system, by climate change, by the intersectional impacts. Then they're not given the sufficient resources to lead the response, nor the financing. And so the patriarchal neo-colonial development model continues, and we stay in the same situation that somebody else mentioned. The other thing that I just wanted to say is that the climate sector can be quite a hostile space for women of the global majority, especially women from the global south. So in my experience as someone with a lot of white privilege, we have to claim space where we can, and it's not easy. There are really big entrenched social norms, which mean it's hard to be our authentic selves, and that constrains our confidence and our creativity. And a lot of us just leave the sector or move from organisation to organisation seeking safety. The recent race report found that only 0.5% of employees in the sector in the UK identify as Arab. And as an Arab, that makes me feel very alone. I can count the Arab women I know on one hand. And in this time, more than ever, with everything going on in the Middle East, many of us affected directly and indirectly, we also feel silenced and scared, and we're not allowed to speak about what's happening to our own families and friends. We don't feel we can be ourselves. And this is somebody who has a lot of white privilege. So I just want to kind of underline that until we have women from the global south, from the working class, from minority communities, in leadership positions with the resources, designing the solutions, equity is very far from reach, and so is a response to the climate crisis in line with the timelines we have. Thank you.
Thank you. Very powerful. May I invite Davile Mokoena to contribute, please?
Thank you so much. It is indeed an honor to be here, and I really love the Climate Sisters. I've learned a new slogan today that we are not a deficit, but we are an asset. Yeah. I'd like to read something, words that I put together when I was looking at this topic. I just don't want to lose any weight, so I'll just read it. Apartheid, colonialism, patriarchy, and modern day neoliberalism have destroyed and undermined the lives of the poor and marginalized. The psychological damage this system have perpetuated has altered people's behaviors, mindsets, and social norms. So inequalities and gender disparities we are experiencing to this day. So these are the words that came to my mind as I was looking at this topic. And these are the system that of oppression that are interconnected. And you know, they mutually reinforce one another. It is through this system that we have pervasive gender gaps, which limit women leadership and women participating in this discourse of climate change. These are the systems that give rise to discriminatory social norms, and systematic biases that also reinforce these gaps that we are experiencing, which are limiting progress in achieving gender equality and also proper climate actions. So just to give a context of South Africa, we are supposed to be 20 years in democracy this year. I don't want to say freedom because we still have a lot of threats of racism and apartheid. South Africa, we're currently facing 3 major challenges. That's poverty, that's inequalities, and unemployment. The gap between the poor and the rich is growing, is becoming bigger. That all these challenges have been exacerbated by the onset of climate impact and COVID. And as a developing country, we haven't recovered. Things are getting worse. And I feel these systems I've mentioned, they still exist globally. And they still perpetuate the challenges that we are facing. We'll never, as developing countries, be called developed countries. I mean, when you look at Global South, when you look at Africa, we are called least developed, developing countries. Until when? When are we going to cut this umbilical cord? It seems to be growing. But anyhow, yeah, so when I mentioned these 3 challenges in South Africa, this is where the climate impacts hit most. Because when you look at the poverty rate, it's women who are in majority. When you look at the unemployment rate, it's women who are in majority. And the inequalities are across the board. But gender inequalities are also increasing. 40% of a single household in South Africa are women-headed household. Now imagine with the impacts of climate change, we experiencing floods, heat waves, and droughts. And that affects women mostly because women as carers and knitters of societies, they are putting families together, communities together, and society together. They are the custodians of food security, of energy, of water. So those are the things that we feel the impacts of climate change when it comes to water, energy, and food security. And these impact women more, and they add to the burden of care work. So also in South Africa, we still have culturally embedded inequalities and also a lot of unequal distribution and roles and responsibilities of men and women. Though with the new generation, I see that changing, but it's still there. And these are the things that exacerbate the climate impacts for women. We're also seeing a lot of privatization of public entities in South Africa. And that also brings a lot of challenges because still it is this system that I've mentioned that are pushing, privatizing public entities. Local communities, marginalized communities are suffering from lack of service delivery. And it's mainly because a lot of public entities are being privatized. So you can just imagine, how are the poor supposed to cope with the impacts of climate change? How are they supposed to adapt? You know? So there is a big gap of the haves and the haves not. And those who have, they're still enjoying the privileges. There's no change of lifestyle, change of mindset, or of how they do things, because they can cope, they can adapt, they can have boreholes, you know, they can install solar panels. But what about the poor communities where women are majority? And those who are privileged, are the other ones who are over producing and over consuming. But the message of cutting down on production and consuming is taken to the local communities who have nothing to do with it. So as an organization, as civil society, this is what we're saying to the government, that, you know, you're sending messages to the wrong people. I mean, poor people, if you tell them stop using plastic, use this, yes, it's true, we need to learn that. We need to learn the new good things and unlearn the bad habits that we are used to. You know, that don't litter, don't do what do they call illegal dumping, you know. But the people who are responsible for the emissions, the carbon emissions, are getting away with it. So we need also to think how we message and direct our messages. Yeah, I just want to end up with a quote from UN Environment that said the only way to identify and implement the best policies for the environment and sustainable development is to close the gender gap. Thank you.
Thank you, Davile. It's really powerful. May I invite Lola to address the question, why is gender, racial and social equity key to addressing the climate crisis?
Thank you. Yes, hi, I'm Lola Fiakin. And as was stated, my journey with climate justice and all of these questions started in the youth climate strike, which some of you might remember. And it's a big question. Why is racial, gender and social equity key to addressing the climate crisis? Well, we have a short time to answer it, and I'll try and keep it short so you have more time for your questions. So thankfully, in terms of addressing this question quite quickly, as Marianne alluded to in her statement, the real answer to this question is quite simple. Why is, particularly with the being International Women's Day tomorrow, why is gender equity key to the climate crisis? Because it's key to A, the causes, B, the outcomes, and C, the solutions. It's really that simple. So we're going to dive into each of those a bit more, but not too much because, as I said, questions. So A, it's a key cause of the climate crisis. So when we look at the systems that create climate crisis and all the different, you know, social and environmental and biodiversity issues that come from that, they're all caused by the same things that produce this system that has patriarchal outcomes. So exploitation of people and planet, this idea that we can divorce ourselves from care, we can divorce ourselves from these systems that keep us intertwined to one another, and we can prioritize profit above all of that. That mantra, that capitalist mantra, creates patriarchal outcomes, and it also creates the climate crisis. That's number one. Then we have number two, the outcomes. So when we look at what the climate crisis creates, it creates outcomes that harm women the most. If there was a natural disaster tomorrow, who do you think it would be that would have to try and find water for their children? Who do you think it would be that would have more difficulty finding a job? What do you think happens to the rates of sexual violence after natural disasters? These aren't difficult questions to answer. No matter what crisis happens, whether it's COVID or climate disasters, it's always marginalized people that are hurt the most, and that includes women. That's number two. Number three, no, I know it's pretty dark, but that's the answer. Number three is a bit more light, and it's the solutions. I like to sum up the solution as care. Care is such a strong feminist watchword. And when I started to think about the climate crisis in terms of care, it really opened up how I started to view this whole issue and the whole tapestry of different things that we're trying to deal with when it comes to how we deal with the climate crisis. Care is something that has a word that has a lot of different meanings. I can use it to describe tucking my little brother in bed at night. And I can also use it to describe a system of, privatized homes which underpay their staff and don't prioritize the actual needs of the people that use them. So it's something that describes a vast range of things that happen in society, from the care industries to simple things that happen in the household. But in all of those different spaces, what we see is that care is systematically devalued and sidelined. Care is viewed as something which does not fit into that neatly into that picture of growth and of divorcing ourselves from one another and prioritizing profit that I just described earlier. It doesn't fit neatly into that picture. The role that it plays in that picture is of being unpaid and undervalued, so that traditionally men can go off and work while women stay at home and don't believe that their work needs to be of the goodness of their heart, and not actually valued or prioritized or remunerated significantly. When we decide that care is something that we want to prioritize in this world, not just in terms of how we think about it, how we imagine what our world exists for, how we imagine what our lives exist for, how we imagine what the purpose of each and every day that we spend on this earth is, why is it that we wake up? Is it to go to work for 8 hours a day? Or is it because of the relationships that we have with the people that we care about, the planet that we care about? When we decide that we want to rethink that system, and we want to put that at the heart of what it means to have green jobs and a green economy and a green planet and climate justice, that creates a future which prioritizes gender and racial and social equity, and that prioritizes all of the relationships and the things that we care about. And that's the outcomes. I said it was a lot cheerier, right? That's a nice one. But this International Women's Day in particular, I'm found reflecting on the fact that ultimately everything that we have ever successfully fought for as women can be lost. And when we win, backlash comes that can hit harder than any of us imagine. We've seen this with a number of different issues over the last couple of years. And really, we don't get anything from being complacent. We don't get anything from forgetting the fact that there is, unfortunately, a well-funded coalition of lobbyists and activists and media personalities and think tanks and politicians whose aim it is to erode the rights that we have won as women. Every single day they wake up and they decide they want to take away our rights to abortion. They want to see us out of the workplace. They want to see us back in the kitchen as trad wives, basically. That's what they want. This is a real thing that exists, and it's really being heavily funded and supported, and they are very organized, right? And we don't get anything when we allow ourselves to be divided, or we allow ourselves to be distracted from the issues that really count, or we allow ourselves to forget that if we do not fight for our rights, even the ones that we felt like we already won 100 years ago, they will be eroded. And so what matters is that we show up each and every single day and we decide that we are going to make the case for these rights. We are going to fight for them, that we are going to promote a systemic, holistic vision of what it means to fight all of these issues that demonstrates to people how all of these things are connected. And luckily, it's really simple, like I just said, just 3 things. The future is not a necessarily feminist one. It will only be one if we claim it, if we decide that it has to be so. Thank you.
Thank you, Lola. So Marianne and Roshini, I know you've already touched on some of these themes earlier, so I don't know if you wanted to contribute to this, or should we can move on to the next? Yeah, so great, lovely. Where are we at now? So because of the timing, I hope it's okay. I'm looking at Kate, but I can't see her. I'm thinking that we might go into the Q&A and maybe pick up some of the questions that we had as part of the Q&A, because I would really like the opportunity for the audience to come in and ask some questions if they have any on what they've been listening to this evening. And as I say, we can pick up some of the set questions maybe as part of the Q&A. Yeah, okay, so I'm going to take 3 questions at a time. So yeah, so I'll take a question here, and is there any more?
The one at the back.
Hi, so my question is, what role does or should civil society organisations in the UK play in ensuring equitable representation in decision making?
Thank you. Would you just like to say who you are? And
sorry, hi, I'm Emily, and I'm here with the Climate Coalition.
Thank you, Emily. The next question.
Hello, my name is Tracy. I volunteer for 2 charities. So one of them is the Lewisham Donation Hub, which is all about supporting those who are facing hardship in their lives through the donations of the London community, through items that would have otherwise gone to landfill or recycling. And the second one is the Youth Climate Collective in New Zealand. So this is all about empowering our young people to be climate leaders. My question is around community engagement and, you know, like how can we build upon that momentum when you don't have access to a lot of funding, money, resourcing? Yeah, that's essentially it. Thank you.
It's lovely. Thank you, Tracy. Okay, so maybe we'll just start with those 2 questions. Would anyone like to come in on the first question from Emily? Yeah, great. Thank you, Lola.
So with the civil society organizations promoting equitable decision making, right? What role do you have? A big one. So I think that it's really key that, I mean, everyone has a role to play in this, right? It comes down to understanding where our positioning is and how we can make the biggest impact. So whether it's the organizations that you might interface with and encouraging them to take more action or to think about things in a different way, or to reconsider how they're addressing different issues. It might be about fostering different collaborations that might not already exist and getting different types of people in the room. If you're someone that's a convener that can actually create spaces where you might have different environmental groups talking to feminist groups, talking to people who are working on housing or on food or da-da-da-da-da. And I think that's something which is great about what Wen does, is really looking at these really particular issues and how they interface with people's lives. And if you can bring people together from maybe big civil society groups and community groups and all these different types of spaces, that's also something that can be useful. I think in terms of really thinking, I think it's important to really think critically about the positions that we hold and how we're effectively using the power that we have. I think that all of us, if we want to be as useful as possible, as soon as we gain any amount of power, we should be thinking, how can I use this to give someone else power? And so if we exist within a big organization, or we have some kind of responsibility or power to create something, or to do something different, it's about saying, okay, who can I empower? Who can I bring into this conversation? How can I ensure that I'm thinking about this in as holistic a way as possible? And when it comes to community engagement without funding, when you manage to answer that one, let me know. Because I wish I knew. I think sometimes it can be useful to think as you're kind of working on like a community level. I think sometimes it can be useful to see that as the outcome and not to think that you have to do something which is a lot bigger than that. Sometimes doing things which are quite simple and take place on quite a small level can be the work within itself. Kind of as the sisters were saying, it's like being able to have that space for conversation, for just bringing people together can sometimes be the work within itself. And that's something which often isn't as flashy or need as much funding, but can be just as powerful and can plant seeds that will grow in the future. So yeah.
Amazing, thank you, Lola. Would anyone else like to come in on either of those questions? Or should I go to the floor? Yeah, no, it was perfect. Thank you so much. Do we have any more questions from the floor? I'll take a couple. If you could just introduce yourself and your question, please.
Hello, I'm Frankie. I work for a very, very local little environmental charity called Sustainable Merton from down south, London. My question for the panel is, a lot of people spoke to the idea of the current economic system being one of the problem. I was wondering if anyone could speak to the idea, or if anyone thinks that degrowth is a suitable solution for the transition that we need.
Thank you, Frankie. Are there any other questions? I see one at the back.
Sorry, just got chatting to a colleague. Hi, I'm Hannah. I work for an environmental charity called Earthwatch. I also volunteer in a community garden with Black Roots. My question was for Diwali. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. So what you said was something that hit me, and I've been thinking for a while. You said you're talking to the wrong people. I work in the education system, and we very often target schools from underrepresented, underserved communities, but we never work with private schools. And I do see a lot of them, learning about this, but they come up with like wonderful technological solutions and stuff like that. So I kind of wanted to address, how do you talk to the right people who need to hear all of this?
Thank you, Hannah. Okay, would anyone like to come in on Frankie's question about the current economic systems and degrowth? Thank you, Marianne.
Anxious about not pouring water all over the table here. So, I mean, I think there's two things here. I mean, I think we need to see some areas of our economy shrink. We actually need to see other bits grow. We need to see more care, for example. We need to see more and better social housing. We need to see, so we need to think, I mean, I think focusing simply just on degrowth as a term can be quite difficult for a lot of people that we've got to convince to engage with, because they already feel that their lives don't have anything, there is nothing left to shrink, and so you can think, you're talking about degrowth, that means I'm going to be poor. I am already as poor as it's possible to get. We actually need to be thinking about redistribution and redistribution of wealth and resources, but also sort of focus of the economy. I mean, I do think we need to get away from the idea that the focus of our economy should be on growth of gross domestic product. I mean, GDP is a really, really poor measure of the health or well-being of the economy. And I felt it particularly strongly the last few days in the run-up to the budget, where every single thing about what the Chancellor was and wasn't going to do was about this sort of entirely fictitious forecast about where growth was going to be in 5 years' time, and whether or not that gave the Chancellor the fiscal headroom to make the tax cuts he needed. And it just distorts our thinking. And so, the media gets obsessed with that, and they don't actually say, Do you know what, Chancellor, we're facing a climate emergency? What are you going to do about that? Do you know what, Chancellor, we've got millions of people who are destitute. What are you going to do about that? So I think we need to get away from the language of growth as being about health. But I am conscious that often the language of degrowth can be very, very alienating for people, particularly the poorest people in our communities, because it just feels like it doesn't recognise how there is no space for their lives to shrink any further than they've already shrunk.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Marianne. Davile. So we're talking to the wrong people.
Thank you for this question. I think what is key is for us to know what message we're sending to whom, because talking to communities is also important. These are the frontline recipients of climate change impact. They need to know what is going on, and they need to know how to adapt and help them to build resilience. However, when it comes to the privilege that we cannot access, we need to make sure that in our dialogues, in our discussions, we have everyone on board, all the stakeholders. So as an organization, because we do training and capacity building on gender and climate change, there's an exercise that we normally do, which we call it a gender walk, where we will put different names in a pocket, where we will put a small scale farmer, a single rural woman with 5 kids, unemployed, putting all the description of what marginalized people and poor people are going through, and also putting names of those who are privileged, the officials, the business people, the politicians, and we'll ask each person to take a name, and you put yourself in the shoes of that person. We ask questions like, if you go to the bank as that person, you are in his or her shoes, do you think you will be able to get a loan? Or the president of the country is in your community. As that woman who sits on the corner who's selling apples, will you know? Will you get that information? Will you be invited? Will you be able to go and attend a meeting about climate change? So just to give people a picture of what is going on, put yourself in those shoes and reflect about that and go and share with your acquaintances. So that's the list we are trying to do, to raise an awareness of how people, the privilege, how they are benefiting from the system, and how the poor are, getting worse in their suffering. I hope I answered your question. Thank you.
Just a little thing about, I think we're talking about like forefronting and centering voices. And I think in order to do that, like, how do we speak to them? How do we speak to communities? It's like, who is them and us? And the people that need to speak to them, then maybe they need to step back and allow the spaces to be, held by them. If you get what I mean, like the people that you need to go and speak to are the people that need to be in those roles. So maybe changing that about a bit might help to solve that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to say, before I did the work I do now, I worked on public engagement on climate, and what we learn, in many contexts, including in the UK, is almost everybody is interested in it. Almost everybody wants to do something about it, but sometimes the language that is used in the movement is alienating. And it doesn't mean we don't believe in these concepts or that these concepts aren't important, but sometimes you have to bring people on a journey with you, and we fail to do that. We also, as you're saying, we put ourselves in the positions when actually it should be trusted messengers, whether it's from a community, from a sector, it could be sports people, it could be religious scholars and leaders, it could be, there's a lens for everybody, but that's one of our biggest failings as civil society, is because many of us in civil society are very privileged. We don't like to take a seat, and sometimes we just need to take a seat.
Thank you, Amira. Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so do we have any more questions from the floor? I think I saw some hands at the back there. You could introduce yourself and your question.
I'm Ellie. I'm volunteering with Wen. I sort of have a question about what we can do as sort of citizens. So we understand what we want and what we need, and you kind of laid out, it seems like a kind of straightforward strategy in terms of what you can do on a local level, but in terms of a national level, especially with the general election coming up, lots of things that we want and need seem almost realistically unattainable. And I was wondering what you would say is a realistic approach that what we can do as individual voters in order to get the things that we need and want in relation to the climate crisis, etc.
Thank you, Ellie. Are there any more questions from the floor? Yeah, there's one at the back there.
Hi, my name's Charlotte. I'm a volunteer with Action Aid. I was wondering, kind of looking around the room, majority of women, which I think is amazing, but I think, as you've mentioned, when we look at who's still making the decisions, who's still in the very powerful positions, it's the majority of men. And so I'm wondering, what is their role in this? Do we need to include them? Should we include them? How do we manage to kind of get them on board more? Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte. Okay. So to Ellie's question, I think, Nina, you've indicated you'd be happy to come in on that.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I mean, I think it's a huge question, but one thing I would say is being politically active in whatever kind of lens that is, whether that's focused on climate activism or activism for gender, racial and social justice. But one thing I would say I've really noticed about UK politics at the moment is a narrative of using economic inequalities and the cost of living crisis as a reason not to take action on climate action. And I think working in a coalition, with different activist groups tackling this from different angles, including, for example, with unions and climate activists and social justice and racial justice advocates, is, I think, really important to tackling the way that the cost of living crisis and energy crisis and climate action are being used, and to try and make the argument really clear and encourage political parties to really stand for an alternative vision, which is one that's being beautifully articulated by Lola, of care, funding social infrastructure, reversing austerity, funding renewable energy and so forth, and actually putting forward a really meaningful alternative. So I guess working in coalition as activists. And just I wanted to briefly touch on the second question, which is that in my role working with cities on inclusive climate policies and programs, many of the women leaders many of the leaders at a city level that were leading this work were women, but many of them were men. And, I think we have plenty of examples of female politicians who have absolutely not been feminist and have absolutely not stood for gender, racial and social justice. So I think we should be looking for feminists and people who prioritize social justice and racial justice, not just trying to talk to women, because there are some men out there who will be willing to make those kind of decisions too. So yeah, just a thought, thinking about people's attitudes as well.
Thank you, Nina. Yeah, definitely. Lola, and I think Roshini, did you want to come on? Okay, so everyone wants to come in on this. No, you go. Thank you, Lola.
Yes, I am sorry. Part of the problem with not having a decent public transport system is that I actually have to leave early. What can we do as citizens? I think one of the most important things we can do is to let our elected representatives know that we actually really care about this, because I think they get an awful lot of lobbying from an awful lot of other people. And, MPs do actually notice what people write to them about. They may not do whatever you want. They may not always take action, but individual letters rather than kind of postcards and generic things that are written from a constituent that says, I care about this and this is why, and this is a really big issue. They read it, they do take notice. And if everybody
who cared about it wrote to their MP, then MPs would recognise that there is actually a powerful lobby here. There are people who really care, because they are facing a lot of, as we've said, very coordinated and organised activism to convince them that actually this is, you know, that they can win votes by doing some sort of culture war, anti-green, anti-woke, whatever thing, and they will believe that because there will be people writing to them saying that sort of thing. So they need to get more letters saying the opposite.
Thank you.
Can I? Or after you?
No, you.
Okay. There was one thing that it's often said that there's not enough money to do the Green New Deal, or more to the point, to do the feminist Green New Deal. Bye.
Thank you, Marianne. Thank you so much.
And actually, there was a paper done by, I think, Dave and Colin of the Green New Deal to just show, by making these slight different calculations, there's billions, trillions of pounds ready to invest. So accessing that information is quite useful for the comeback that says, oh, there's no money for this. And then also just to say that, like, you know, all of these problems are from the dehumanization of people and planet. And if we think of what's happening in Palestine, what's happening in Sudan, and we get all behind that, that's some of the biggest climate disasters, never mind all the other disasters involved in it, then that could maybe help. So if everybody kind of sung from the same hymn sheet on that, would be really helpful.
Thank you, Roshini. Lola?
Yeah, so, yeah, okay. On the first question, that I think that also linked to one of the questions we were asked to consider earlier, which was like, how is the UK government going to take forward this agenda? The next UK government take this agenda forward in terms of equity on all these different levels. And I think it's an interesting question to consider, because I think sometimes, as I said, it's like we can see the national stuff is like very separate from the community stuff. But I think really engaging with a strong model of what community organizing looks like and the power that it can formulate and create allows us to think about national politics differently, and about what creates the conditions for different kinds of national politics differently. I think in terms of this coming election, I think it's important that we never look at elections as things where, you know, we're going to wake up the next day and the whole country is going to be different. Like, really, it's just a moment which, if you want to look at it from a position as someone who is an activist or a campaigner or a community organizer, you really just see these moments as like touch points where you can either increase or decrease your power, and you can also use them to mobilize and increase your power in different ways other than just what the result is of the election and what, you know, what politician ends up winning. So you can use an election as a way to create community power, or a way to galvanize people, or as a way to start different types of conversations, or as a way to bring different types of people together. And then what that does is it creates the kind of conditions that you require to actually then hold a government to account when it comes to who ends up being in power in the next kind of election. Because you don't really, the situation that I don't want to see is where we kind of convince ourselves that everything sits on an election, and then we win the election, and ultimately, unsurprisingly, they don't do what we want them to do, and then everyone is just like, that's sad. It's like, actually, we need to be ready for the day after the general election comes to then start fighting. That's when the real fight starts, is then organizing and holding their feet to the fire and holding them accountable and saying, actually, because I mean, we all really know who's going to end up in power, and they don't really want to do what they're supposed to do, and they're already saying that they don't want to do what they're supposed to do. So it's like, we have to be ready to actually tell them, you need to be more ambitious. You need to think in a more holistic way. You need to engage with different groups. You can't just continue this like horrible status quo that we're seeing that this party is trying to entrench. Actually, we can't let that stand. We have to say enough is enough. There's kids in the room, so I'm not going to swear, but you know, we've had a lot of bad stuff over the last couple of years, and we need to basically be really just getting into a position where we can organize to hold whatever party comes into power accountable for what they're going to do, because guaranteed they're not going to come in and day one and institute like a Green New Deal and all the different stuff that we need to see. So we need to be organized and ready. And then in terms of what guys need to do, this is going to sound like a joke, but it's not really a joke. But really, we do need people to like cook the food and clean and organize and set things up, because I mean, all the time you're going to see, and you know, I think a lot of us don't really notice it, but a lot of us do because we're in this room. But you notice who it is that does the care work that goes into creating all of these spaces, and usually it's a certain type of person. And in a lot of the feminist movements that we've seen over the decades, what's the role of men? Run the crash, bring some food, do the potluck, do the caring, make it so that actually, you know, the women can engage with this work as fully as possible without also, you know, having to do the setting up and the cleaning and the running around everyone and doing all the admin and all the behind the scenes, not so glamorous work that needs to be done. Men need to be able, if they want to be good allies, to not just engage with the issues, not just care about all this stuff, but also step up and do the admin work that needs to be done, because we still see that even in the most progressive movement spaces, it's women that are doing it consistently all of the time, and that needs to change. So
thank you, Lola. So I think this will be our final contribution as we come to the end, but thank you so much, Amira.
Sorry.
No.
Does anyone else have anything burning? Okay, I was just going to say on the politics thing. Okay, I hope I don't get fired for saying this. But my mantra has for a long time been express yourself with the confidence of a mediocre white man. Why? Because one of the things I learned as a researcher when I was working with marginalized communities in Pakistan and some other parts of the world that are really affected by the climate crisis, there's something that I learned about which is called attitudinal vulnerability. So of course, like vulnerability exists that's structural, but also because of the way that women are treated, particularly women from marginalized minorities, sometimes we also hold ourselves back because of the fear of how we're going to be treated or we're not going to be heard. And I think part of the challenge with politics here is we need more diverse women to put themselves forward. And it is hard, but we have amazing women leaders when they have the chance to do it. Part of the role for men is to push them forward and say, I've got you, get out there. We want to hear what you have to say. You're an amazing leader. And I think that doesn't happen enough. There are men who do it though. One of my friends is in the audience is exactly like that. But those are the kinds of, you know, the leadership pieces about not just privileged, confident, Oxbridge educated, private school educated women who there are far too many of in the climate space and in politics. It's about all sorts of different women and all sorts of different people feeling the confidence to put themselves forward and bring those diverse solutions that we all need to hear.
It's amazing. Thank you, Amira. Thank you for those really inspiring words. And yes, definitely need to all find our voice and empower others, as Lola says, to find their voice as well. So it's been a really wonderful evening, and I'm sorry I don't think we've been able to get to all of the questions that people wanted to put forward today, but as we come to an end, I'm just wanting to say thank you so much to all of our wonderful panelists for your contributions today and for just hearing and listening and responding to the queries and questions that have been put to us, and for enlightening us about the different types of activities and work that you're all doing. Thank you also for Amnesty International, obviously, for hosting us here this evening, for all our stall holders, for Kiki, our caterers from Seeds of Wild, the Wen team, of course, and volunteers, and our funder, Octopus Renewables. And last but not least, to all of you who have come here this evening to support this and to support this event. Thank you so much. It's been amazing, and you've all been fantastic. So thank you. And I bring the session to an end. Next time.
Oh, was there any that you were like, oh, that's juicy? I want to jump in? Or were you